Hi, and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's my question for today. What does it take to successfully co-create with others? Collaboration, working together, is a huge part of the process of us communicating in ways that create the kind of social world we want for ourselves. But it is hard. We misunderstand each other. We have different goals, we get frustrated, and sometimes we just get in our own way. I want to get us thinking about co-creation because our conversation partner for today has some wisdom to share about negotiating, which is kind of just another way to talk about co-creating. Today we start part one of our conversation with Beth Fisher-Yoshida. Beth is on the board of stewards for the CMM Institute. She's a professor at Columbia University, an executive coach, and among many other things, Beth is also the author of New Story, New Power, A Woman's Guide to Negotiation. Beth does a lot of consulting work with organizations, but she makes it clear in our conversation that negotiation happens in all areas of our life, personal and professional. So this conversation is for everyone. In part one of this conversation today, we're going to get to hear more about Beth, including some stories from her life and others about what it really looks like to co-create meaning together, how we can learn to tell a new story for ourselves, and what it means to step into the new power that she writes about. Let's dive in with Beth. Hi, Beth. Thanks for being here today. I'm so looking forward to our conversation and getting to talk to you.
Hi, Abbie. I really am looking forward to it as well. So thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Before we dive into the real content of our conversation, I'm wondering if you would share some stories about yourself to introduce yourself a little bit. Maybe knowing some of the topic of the conversation we're going to have today, you could share some stories that feel like good context for that you want people to know about you going into this conversation.
Okay, sure. So most of my time is spent being a professor of practice at Columbia University in the city of New York. I also direct the master's program in negotiation and conflict resolution. And then I always say, if you stick around long enough, you have other positions that sort of pop up. So I'm also the executive director of a consortium that we have, which is the Advanced Consortium for Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, which does a lot of work with the CMM Institute. Mm-hmm. And then within which is AC4 for short, for the acronym, within AC4, I also direct the Youth, Peace, and Security, which now is Youth, Peace, and Society program. I have to remember to change that title in my head. Uh-huh. And separate from what I'm doing at the university, I also do consulting and coaching. So over the years, my consulting practice has focused more on going into organizational contexts and doing some kind of assessment intervention around conflict. Sometimes it's, something mild, just like, well, let's just sort of come to an agreement on what a vision and mission is. And sometimes it's much more trying to intervene in a very toxic situation because the conflict has gone on for what I would say is too long, maybe 5 years that people have been working in those conditions. And then separately from all that, I also do writing, as you know. And so my interest in research and writing, and I should say research really with an applied research. I'm more of a scholar practitioner. So I started more as a practitioner and transitioned into somewhere in the middle. So my research recently has focused a lot on women and negotiation. And my book that came out earlier this year is New Story, New Power, A Woman's Guide to Negotiation. And I've just recently decided that I'm going to do another book on women and negotiation, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly the framing of it, but it will be something related to more in-depth case studies, and I just can't decide yet if it's going to be real women with real names or real women with fictitious names. So that's sure. Kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's great.
Let me just make one more connection. So then Please. The CMM part, I studied at Fielding Graduate University in the 1990s. Seems like an incredibly long time ago. And I met Barnett Pierce there at that time. And that's when I was introduced to CMM. And since then, CMM just permeates every part of my life, all the work that I do, research practice, teaching, everything. It's just in there all the time. So it's not even that I have to consciously say, okay, what am I going to do CMM-ish? It's that I'm doing it and just thinking, well, how am I going to frame it and which angle and all of that. So that's enough about me for now.
Yeah, no, that is a great start. One follow-up question I'm just curious for the people that I get to talk to, that are in the world of communication, is what makes you passionate about what you do in the world of communication and conflict and the consulting you do?
Yeah, good question. So I think part of it is when people get that aha kind of moment, and it doesn't have to be earth-shattering aha. It just needs to be a shift, as minor or major as it is, just a shift in perspective, which happens through CMM, where something that was not explicit becomes explicit and sheds a new light on something that they didn't realize before. So people are able to now reframe how they look at something. They're able to get new insights. And because of that, then they get more choice, more flexibility in what they're choosing to do to go forward. So there's that sense of agency as well, which I believe we all have to some degree. Of course, there are constraints of how much you can exert your agency rather, in any particular context. But that's what excites me, is when people get new perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's very similar for me too. The idea of meaning making and that we get to choose the meaning is what really kind of got me hooked in the world of CMM, because that was kind of a novel idea to me. Growing up, I didn't have that kind of perspective. It was kind of like, here's the objective, here's what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. And there wasn't a lot of conversation about how those meanings were made. And so to explore that has been really meaningful for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Beth, to use the CMM-ish language, what is your idea of what a better social world looks like?
Well, a couple of different things. I was just yesterday actually thinking about a little talk I'm going to give at somebody's dinner. And when I go to Colombia later this week, I'm going to be at a dinner. We're sponsoring a dinner for somebody who just completed his university. And in Colombia, it's a 5-year program. So there are 10 semesters. So he just completed it against all odds, because he was a student who probably would never have reached that university. And long story short, we were able to work out something where he was able to do it. And he had the fortitude and the commitment to do that. And he persevered, and he's a brilliant artist, and he became even more brilliant because he learned so many different techniques. So we're having this dinner, this celebration dinner, and I said, you know what, I'm going to give a little talk, a little speech in Spanish, which is not my strength by any means. But so I'm having a friend of mine check it now, but I was thinking about what I was going to say, and they all know CMM. And so what I was going to say, one part of it is really that when we succeed in anything we do, all of us succeed, right? And so it's a matter of shifting the vibrations in the world, just shifting something. So somebody called Rupert Sheldrake, who talks about the morphinogenic field, and not to get too technical about things, but in essence, it's where we all learn from like a collective memory. So if something happens, and I was giving the example in my speech too, before anybody knew how to ride a bicycle, it was incredibly difficult to ride a bike. Nobody knew how to ride it, right?
Yeah, right.
One person started to ride it, and then more people started to ride it. There was something about the vibrations in the universe where other people were able to do it more easily. So what I want to impart on these youth leaders that I work with is that there's no need for jealousies or for envy, which sometimes does happen, that there's a reason to celebrate, because when one person succeeds in anything they're doing, it already sets the plate for other people to succeed as well. It's just one step closer. Yeah. And so that I want people to celebrate with each other in that. So that's what a better social world will be, where not only do we support and love each other and make that space possible, but that we celebrate each other, and that we feel the joy in somebody else's success also being good for us, not that we should be envious of that. So that's kind of what we're working towards.
Yeah. Yeah. That I know that gender is a big lens that you use and talk about and think about and research and write about. And it's a compelling one for me too. And that makes me think about that is maybe especially true for like women's relationships to each other, that there's a lot of like comparison and competition that kind of, if you're living in a patriarchal society, that's maybe one of the tools of keeping women oppressed, or, whatever language you would use there to say that when women are in competition with each other, when we're not celebrating each other's advances and seeing other women's success as our own success, or seeing, kind of like a scarcity mindset of, oh, the resources are limited, so if you're doing well, that's taking away from me doing well. That kind of keeps you stunted and not able to grow as a group or a community.
Yeah, if we think about the token spot that's open, so, okay, we have a woman here, check that off the list, then that is the scarcity mindset you mentioned. On LinkedIn, I was really happy to see that there's a hashtag like women helping women, or women supporting women, or women for women. I forgot exactly all the terminology, but I always like that because, that's what happens, is that we make it possible for all of us to be there. Then that means when we do, we creating like a critical mass, which shifts, like Malcolm Gladwell says, the tipping point of what shifts things, so that it's no longer the token woman or the token underrepresented group in any kind of diversity initiative, but it really is that's the norm. And so even that we don't have to pay attention to it is where we're headed. That's a good social world too, that we don't have to see what's the composition of this group or this team or this organization. We just take it for granted because it is diverse naturally, without having to pay attention to it in that special way. Because then it does seem like tokenism. And then at school, we're always talking about admissions and hiring and what's happening with affirmative action, what's happening in DEA, and how do you create the space not only to bring people in, but to mentor them and nurture them so that they succeed. Because that's something that I think in general, we're not as good at. We're better collectively at bringing people in the recruiting process, but we're not as good at keeping them and maintaining them and helping them grow. And so later this month, I'm doing a talk for women in cable television. So it's communication, media, entertainment. And I was doing a little bit of research and preparing for that. And especially past or post-pandemic, there's a whole new phenomenon happening in the workplace. So in general, people are leaving their workplace more than they did before. People are more selective in what they want. They're particular in what they want. But when it comes to women, more women leaders are leaving than men. And so the other thing people are asking for is more flexibility in the workplace. They want to be able to work remote, because we learned through the pandemic we can work remotely. There's some things that are nicer in person, but we can also do remote, and having that flexibility. So for me, I say, okay, let's turn that disaster into an opportunity, because organizations are struggling. When you look at the pipeline, the people coming up in the pipeline have been reduced in terms of diversity. So it's an opportunity for negotiation and for having more agency and more strength from your negotiation position. And I'm saying not to be arrogant or nasty or stubborn about it, but just to say, this is a source of strength for me because I know I'm needed and I know what I have to offer. So let me figure out a way in collaboration through negotiation, work out something that's good for the organization and good for me as well. So I think women have a good position there. And I was looking, because I'm also giving a talk in Colombia to a group of women in a workshop, I also want to update the statistics for the Colombian situation, which I captured a couple of articles. Now I just need to put it into my slides.
Yeah, you're making me think about other conversations I've had of, maybe you'll see on like a church sign say, all are welcome here. And there's kind of a conversation of like saying that all are welcome here is different than this space is specifically designed for you. Because maybe there's not people that look like you in that space already, or people are, wanting to be welcoming, but not really, or maybe in a more kind of like you're saying, tokenizing way, not in a really, let's really create a belonging in a community that is, equally valuing all of our stories and our experiences and backgrounds. And I'm curious, in your consulting work, you kind of ask the question of, okay, how do we're good at the recruiting, but how do we, move beyond that to really incorporate all of these people and their stories and their experience into an organization? What do you have a kind of answer for that? What do you share with people that you consult with on that topic?
It's a hard thing to do because you're talking about systems in organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times people have this attitude where, well, it's a system, so it's this thing, right? It's this thing that's created and it's a structure and I can't do anything about it. I'm just one person. What am I going to do? And so on. So they don't necessarily feel empowered to do something about it. So then I think, okay, yeah, but who makes the systems? People make the systems. So, if you think about self as instrument of change, the better you are, then wherever you go and whatever you do, you're already making a more positive difference in the situation. So then I say, okay, so let's not try to tackle the whole system because that can be quite overwhelming, but let's see what you can do on a day-to-day basis. And so a really good place to start is like people who are like mid-level managers. Mid-level managers, I think, are like very pivotal in an organization. So of course I like to work with leadership. I like to work with, frontline, grassroots, all of that. But the mid-level managers are where you can really make a difference. So what a lot of people don't realize is that when they move up the ranks, right, they move into managing others. And it's not something they specifically trained for or develop those skills. They develop some kind of technical skills. And then because they're good at that, they advance and they move into a managerial role. And too often organizations do not prepare people to be managers. So then they go in and then, all of a sudden they're struggling, right? They're struggling being a manager. Well, of course they're struggling because they don't know
Right.
They learned how to be a manager. Now, yes, some people have a natural inclination to managing others and nurturing others, and that's great, but there's always something you can learn. So then they send them more remedial, to, well, you need management training or you need coaching, whatever it is. But once they realize in that position that they also have a responsibility to those moving up in the ranks who they supervise, then they can start to create opportunities for people to advance in their careers. So that means maybe, and this is something that you don't only need a manager to help you do, you can do yourself, but in the conversation of a performance review, it's a great time to not only talk about past performance and feedback, but where am I going next? So this is where I prepare people for their negotiation, for their performance review, to talk about, mentorship or learning and development opportunities, or what's the career path trajectory for me? How am I doing? Where's my gap? How can I fill in and enhance the skills that I need for my next level? What kind of projects can I be placed on to give me visibility and give me learning and opportunity? Because there are some like sectors that are sexier than others or that you get more opportunities for. So managers can do that in the conversation. People who are being managed can do that. So that's how you start to make a difference. You create the path, and then you also create the opportunity for people to take up their power to move along that path. And I think this is why younger people in the workforce today are staying maybe 2 years in a situation. So when I was coming up in the ranks, 2 years is, oh my God, this person jumps around a lot. We can't rely on them. They're not loyal. They're not dependable, because on their CV, it has like 1.5 or 2 years. Today, it's like, oh, wow, they stayed there 2 years. It's a very different attitude, because 2 years is like a big deal now, because people want to make sure that they're not being stunted in their development. They want to know that there's a place for them to go. And this includes all people, even people with diverse backgrounds who may not have been as hireable before are gaining more power in their choice. Not everybody, it's not a total revolution in the country, no, but there is more of that here, because when I was mentioning the pipeline earlier, it's also younger people, younger women under 30 are way more selective in what they're doing, which means that if they're not joining certain organizations because they don't see a place for them there, they don't see women in senior roles, they don't see opportunity for them, then that means the organization is going to suffer down the road because they don't have enough younger people in their pipeline, especially younger women. So that means that the younger women have more strength in their negotiations, and the organizations need to figure out, how do we need to adapt to bring in younger talent and keep them there? Because everybody may not become the CEO, but we need to bring more people into more senior levels. And we can only do that by bringing them earlier into the pipeline.
Yeah. I'm thinking about that you referenced earlier that in your research, you found that it's a lot of women in news media are leaving. And so I'm curious about this difference between, do you stay in an organization, in a workplace, and work to make it better, or do you leave? And I'm curious about the role of negotiation in maybe people making that decision. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So it goes back to one of my big things, which people who know me know I'm always talking about self-awareness. So that's the first thing. So you need to strengthen yourself. And going back to self as instrument of change, you need to strengthen yourself so that you are more grounded, more centered, and more aware of what's really critically important to you. So, and self-awareness is something that you continue to do your whole life, because you mentioned that I had a complex life and all that, but we're all complex beings, right? So we all have different personas that make up who we are. And so this is something I've been working on lately too, is when you are in conversation with somebody, negotiation, conversation, interaction, a certain part of you comes forward more than other parts, right? Depending on who you are. So if I'm talking to my daughters, then me being a mother becomes stronger than if I'm talking to a colleague, because my role as a mother
Right.
is going to come out. Unless we're talking about our children, then we shift perspectives, right? So you have to be aware of that. So that means that in preparing for a negotiation, which everybody needs to prepare, regardless of how much you think you know the other person and how much you think you know the topic, then you need to know, okay, what is this person going to trigger for me, and which part of me is going to become more dominant in that role, right? So that's what happens. So then you have to figure out, okay, who am I? And then who am I also means identifying the different stories that you carry with you in your different narratives you carry, and where those narratives came from. So you have your personal story about who you are, which is influenced by your social story, which means the social world around you, the social media, the media, anything in your community that comes around. How does that influence you, and which of those stories are you carrying consciously or unconsciously? Your family, what are the different stories that you grew up hearing in your family about what's possible for you, about who you are, which influence your personality? The kind of work you do, your profession. So that means whichever profession you're selecting, then you have influences from that profession about who you are. And, all of those different layers. And so it could be also that if you are a sports person, and then your identity is around sports. If you're an artist, your identity around art. So all of those stories play a role. And inside of all of those stories are some of the stories about negotiating. So that means you may have heard, you can do whatever you want. You're capable, or, well, you're not good enough. You're not old enough. You're not, you're too young. You're not experienced enough. A mixture of stories. So in the process of me working with people and they are identifying their stories, then I have to say, okay, now that you have this collection of stories, and there'll be more the next time you think about it, because every time you reflect on it, it's that snapshot of a moment in time when you're thinking about that. Which of those stories are generative? Which of those stories give you strength? Which of those stories build you up to be who you are? And which of those stories get in the way? Which of those stories block you? So the ones that aid you and are generative and strengthening, you want to grow those stories so they become the more dominant stories in your life. And the stories that get in your way, you want to, I love it if we can just delete, press delete, just delete them, or rewrite them, change them into what they're doing. So that's kind of the coaching, the training, the workshop I do. It's what I mention in my book a lot, because the book is very practical. So that means people can pick it up and sort of turn to any section, especially section 3, where they have all the different CMM tools and other things in there, where people can work through what it is they want to work through for themselves to be the best they can be, so that they empower themselves when they go into their negotiation.
I'm imagining that maybe some people hear the words negotiation and think, well, I'm not an aspiring CEO at a Fortune 500 company. This is not really relevant to me. But I think you're approaching it from a more holistic way. You're not just talking about negotiation in the workplace, right? We're negotiating all day, every day in our own lives. Could you talk about that side of negotiation in our personal lives too?
Sure. So when I was writing the book, which took a couple of different years to put it together, I first was going to focus it on the workplace, and it was going to be about careers and so on. And because a lot of my, organizational work is in the workplace. And then I started thinking, no, women are so much more than that, right? So we have all of these different things we're negotiating. So then there's a section on negotiating your personal life, your personal relationships, your romantic relationships, negotiating your family, different roles there, and negotiating just in the everyday business of going to the dry cleaners or something like that. And then I also, when I was writing the book, the Me Too movement was very strong. And I said, I cannot not pay attention to that. So I thought, how do I do this? Is such a delicate, sensitive topic. And I didn't want to just get into it too much. So I thought, okay, so I talked about negotiating compromising situations. That's how I framed it. And the reason is, it's very complex. And I'll just tell another story about that in a minute. But the complexity is that when you are, let's say, in the workplace, a lot of times the people who have power in the workplace, those are the people that may make you uncomfortable and that you may put you into compromising situations. And so if you go into those situations, then you could be compromising yourself in some way, which is not what you want. And if you don't engage with those people, then you could be losing out on different kind of career opportunities. So what do you do? So thinking about different strategies about how do you engage with these people? Do you have somebody else in the room? Do you make sure that the doors are like, what are you doing? Of course, at the end of the day, if you're uncomfortable, you are uncomfortable. And that talks about your emotional, psychological, physical safety. If any of those safety feelings are compromised, then of course you just exit immediately, right? So I was doing this book talk in May in Florida, and this young woman raised the question, and I felt that it wasn't an innocent question. I felt like there was something in her behind the question. And she said, when is a no a no? That's such a great question, because in the world of negotiation, without talking about compromising situations, a no is like, nope, can't do that, and then you don't take no for an answer, you probe further.
Yeah, right.
Is okay, we need more resources. Nope, not in the budget, can't do that. So you don't just walk away, you want to go further. So I just stood there for a minute and I said, wow, that's like a really big question. And then I said, it depends on which no we're talking about. And then I talked about that in the world of negotiation, without compromising your safety, no is an invitation to probe further, ask more questions, get to the bottom of it, because sometimes people's initial reactions are put the hand up, no, but it doesn't mean that is a final no. It means it's an opportunity for conversation. However,
right.
If you're in a situation where your emotional, psychological, physical safety is being threatened, that is a very firm no. So you leave. Now, then I said, okay, so sometimes we're in situations where I may be, it's not blatant, but I may be in conversation or negotiation with somebody, and I may think, wow, I'm getting a feeling of discomfort here. What is that feeling? Why am I feeling so uneasy? He didn't say anything specifically, but I'm getting the creepy feeling like yuck, So then I said, okay, so you take a break. Say, listen, I think I need a 10-minute break. Let's just break for now. You leave the room, you leave that environment. So you're physically going out, and then you think about it and think about, okay, what are the other possibilities? Like, why you get in touch with your own feelings, which is why the self-awareness part important. What is it this guy is doing that may be reminding me of somebody else, or what is it? So do I feel safe to continue or do I not? And so that's where you go back and say, listen, I think we need to end this conversation now. I'm not feeling comfortable, and maybe we can pick it up another time, but I'll let you know. And that would mean you invite other people in, or maybe you go back and you say, listen, I'm not sure I understood you correctly when you said whatever it was. Can you elaborate on that? And then maybe they go, oh, okay, it was my misunderstanding of what they meant there. So you have a choice, and that's the part that I think is empowering, is understanding that I don't need to be stuck in this situation. I take care of me first. And by taking care of me first, I decide if that is safe or not. And so that also is in the book. And it still is the judgment that you have to use your own judgment. But therefore, the more you know yourself, going back to the self-awareness, and the more you try to understand the other person and where he or she is coming from, then you make those decisions about, where am I going to go with this? Because if you totally cut yourself off, then you might, like I said, be missing those career opportunities. You want to think about, how can I still have access to the career opportunities without compromising myself, without making me unsafe? And then you get to think a little more creatively about how to create those situations of safety.
Yeah,
That's a lot I just said.
No, it was great. It was great. And I'm just hanging on to, I don't know exactly how I'm meaning to phrase this question, but just this kind of idea of like, if you're thinking about what a better social world is for you, a better social world in my mind, in like the working world, would be one where no male bosses make female employees uncomfortable or feel danger, you know, and yet also acknowledging that is not the reality right now, that those are really real experiences that people have and face every day. And so I hear what you're saying of, here's how to deal with those situations. And then also, my heart is like, we shouldn't even have to be having these conversations. It's the people that are making other people uncomfortable that need to do the, self-awareness and changing. What do you think about that conversation?
Yes. And I remember recently I was having a conversation with somebody about equity. Oh, yes. Okay. We were talking about male allies, right? And male allyship. And and an ally is different than a mentor, different than a sponsor, different than a coach, right? So an ally is somebody who sort of sticks up for you and has your back and creates more of an equitable situation in the workplace. And we were talking about that, and some of the findings were that if it needs to be more explicit, and we're talking about explicit and implicit and all that, and I'm like, it's like so crazy that we even have to be having this conversation, because ideally, talk about better social worlds, we'd be working it out where we don't need to have allies, because there already is equity in the workplace. So yes, I think things shouldn't be handed to people. I think you need to work and earn and strive, and everybody has their own abilities and talents that they want to develop. And then I think that those opportunities need to be provided. And that's where the equity comes in, is that we're not all starting in the same place, but we need to have the opportunity to grow in whatever ways we can and want to. And it shouldn't be a person, or because of who we are, blocking that path. That if we choose to do something and we have the ability to do that, then those opportunities should be presented to us so that it's an equitable, equal opportunity. And that's the part where I think makes a better social world. Not everybody will take it up. Not everybody wants to take it up, but those that do should be able to. And that's the part that makes it more equitable. It's the same idea that when I do go to Columbia, I work with people who don't necessarily have access to some education. And so I'm happy to just teach different things to different people, because I know they're going to use it and they're going to use it well. And part of the amazing part of my work there is that in the 9 years I've been going there and working different youth leaders, and a lot of them I've been working with for 8 or 9 years, they all use CMM. It's all a part of what they do, which is so amazing. And just give a couple of stories there. So there was one time when I saw somebody over the course of 2 years, but I wasn't really up to date on what he was doing and all that. And then, so a few years ago, I'm trying to remember if it was like just at the end of the pandemic, like we were starting to travel again, or just before, I can't remember. He said, Beth, I want to show you something. So I went to see something, and it just brought tears to my eyes, because what he had done in that 2-year space, when I didn't know all the projects he was working on, he was working for a foundation that worked with graffiti artists, and he was an organizer of graffiti artists. And so he was working with a community, and he was asking the community members, what does reconciliation mean to you? Because, Colombia had more than 60 years of civil war, lots of conflict. So working with a community and asking, what does reconciliation mean to you? And he was using different tools of CMM, different CMM models, for them to make explicit the different ideas they had about reconciliation. Then he called in a group of graffiti artists. And the graffiti artists, he said, okay, this is what reconciliation means to this community. And then they came up with some visual images, and they worked together to create this tremendous mural, which is outside the Museum of Memory in Medellin. So he took me to see the mural, and I I just stood there with my mouth open. He was telling me the story, and I said, "Oh my God, you like
Wow.
blink 2 years later, look at what happened." And he was using CMM because
Hmm.
CMM provided it's like the vehicle that allowed people to talk about things that might have been just uncomfortable or painful for them, but through the use of CMM, they could like separate themselves from it a little bit, make it a third object, and so they were able to do that. And then the graffiti artists did that. And so now we're doing another project in another place following that same methodology. We wanted to create a baseline to do a monitoring and evaluation to see the effectiveness of this particular organization providing resources to a group. And so we have this group of women in this community, and they're trying to create like a timeline. It's kind of like a serpentine model, creating their timeline over the years of when their background a little bit and they formed. And so one of the things we've been doing with the serpentine model is also creating these timelines where it's people's personal story, the timeline of the social story, and a timeline of the organizational story, and looking at those points of intersection. What was happening to you and socially when the organization formed? And so that's what we're working on now. And then we're bringing in graffiti artists to also depict different visual images for the mural that they are identifying through the timeline, through the CMM process. And that should be done, I think, by next summer, I'm hoping. So we're working on that. So it's amazing.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's really heartwarming.
That's beautiful, and a great example of co-creation, which, is you're hand in hand with negotiation. And again, everything is a negotiation in our relationships because we're co-creating with others, and it's not something you could take for granted that everyone has the same definition of something like reconciliation. And so coming together and making that meaning together that's a really beautiful example of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I know one of your lenses is, to talk about intercultural communication. And so I'm curious, in your conversation around gender and negotiation, what differences do you see in somewhere like Colombia, where you've spent a lot of time and done a lot of work, and the culture that you and I are most intimately familiar with in the United States?
It's something that is recently really caught my interest, and I don't know if I'm going to do a research project on this, but it's kind of like really needling me a little bit. Like I'm really curious about it, and that's the paradox of Colombian women, and I not to overgeneralize, but what in my years of being there and the women I've met, amazingly strong, beautiful women with great presence, and regardless of whether they are just like community leaders or mothers who maybe have lost their children and are to violence and are just getting out there and doing what they need to do to survive and have a really better sustenance, and nurturing other women, to women who are successful in media or in academia, whatever it is. So all of these beautiful, strong women. And then you have the, macho patriarchy of the culture, and they're also submissive. And I'm like, I'm trying to figure out, like, what is this dichotomy here? It's like they're strong in certain ways and then submissive in other ways. And I guess we all are.
Yeah.
But it just seemed so in my face there, because every time over the years, when I kept meeting like really strong women, I'm like, wow, and I was like surprised. And then I'm like, no, I'm not surprised, because wow, they're really dynamic, and the women I've met, once they have an idea or get hold of something, it's like, watch out, like they're not backing down. But then at the same time, it is a patriarchal society. And so they are forced to be submissive in certain ways, and I'm like, wow, and it doesn't mean that we're not that way in the US too. Because I remember years ago when I lived in Japan, people would say to me, oh, women in the US are so liberated. And I'm like, well, and I remember seeing this, I don't know if it was like 60 Minutes or something. There was a show on, and this is in the 1980s, I believe it was. There was a show on where it was talking about little girls becoming like, putting on makeup and going to like fashion shows and doing all this modeling and stuff. I'm like, oh my God, like putting those messages into little kids. And so somebody had said that to me. I'm like, well, no, we're all not. I mean, I come from the New York. So yeah, on the coasts and in different places inside. But I mean, it's just a mixture of different people. So it's not that only Colombian women have that paradox. I think it's just an example that might be easier for me to study, but it's all over. And so I'm curious about that, is the strength and the submission, and how do you make sense of that? This is sense making process. Yeah. How do you make sense of that for yourself, and how do you make sense of that in the culture and so on? And that's just so fascinating to me, and that's something I want to explore more.
Okay, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Beth, but join us next week for part 2, where we will talk more about her book and also about gender as a lens that we both consider in our own lives and in our work. In the meantime, between this episode and our next, I'd like to offer you some next turns to keep this conversation alive in your own life. To do that, I'll point you towards the questions I posed at the top of the show notes. Be considering these questions for yourself. Like we always talk about, it's first about building awareness and doing that reflecting, and then deciding what kind of action you can take from there. My hope is that these 3 questions help prompt you on that journey. So the questions I want you to be thinking about are: what do you negotiate in your life? What is your relationship to belonging? And what is your identity? How do these things affect the way you show up in the world? And finally, what is something new you can try to better advocate for yourself or negotiate with others? As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to move us one step closer toward creating those better social worlds we're always talking about. As far as some podcast-specific next turns, I'd like to invite you to invite someone else into this conversation. Please share this episode with someone you think it would be meaningful for. And also reach out to me. You can do that through the website, through email, or through Instagram and YouTube, all of which you can find links to in the show notes of this episode. I love to keep the dialogue alive with you, hear your feelings, thoughts, ideas, questions. I welcome it all. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.